Charles Manson, a name that evokes horror and fascination. To many, he's a symbol of the dark side of the 1960s counterculture, a man whose influence led to unspeakable violence. Today on Keto and Crime, we delve into the life and crimes of one of the most infamous figures in American history. Charles Miller Manson was born November 12, 1934, in Cincinnati, Ohio, to 15-year-old Ada Kathleen Maddox, hailing from Kentucky. Manson's biological father appears to have been a Colonel Walker Henderson Scott Sr. of Kentucky as well, against whom Maddox filed a paternity suit that resulted in an agreed judgment in 1937. Scott had worked intermittently in local mills and had a reputation as a con artist. He actually allowed Maddox to believe that he was an actual military colonel, although colonel was just his name. When Maddox told Scott that she was pregnant, he informed her that he had been called away on Army business, and after several months, she realized he had no intention of returning. Manson never had any contact or knew anything of his biological father. In August of 1934, before Manson's birth, Maddox married William Eugene Manson, a laborer at a dry cleaning business. Maddox often went on drinking sprees with her brother Luther Maddox, leaving Charles with babysitters. Maddox and her husband divorced on April 30th, 1937, after William alleged gross neglect of duty by Maddox. Charles retained William's last name of Manson, and on August 1st, 1939, Kathleen and Luther were arrested for assault and robbery and sentenced to 5 and 10 years of imprisonment, respectively. So, as you can see, criminal intent runs in the Manson family, or Maddox Manson family. Manson was placed in the home of an aunt and uncle in 𝗥𝗏𝗀, West Virginia. His mother was paroled in 1942. Manson later characterized the first weeks after she returned from prison as the happiest time in his life. She evidently paid a lot of attention to him and did not doff him off to go running around with her brother. Weeks after her release, Manson's family moved to Charleston, West Virginia, where he continually played truant, and his mother spent her evenings drinking. So he skipped school, and she was back to drinking. She was arrested for grand larceny, but not convicted. Later, they moved to Indianapolis, where Maddox met alcoholic 𝗚𝗏𝗀𝗃 Jr., and through an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting, and married him in August of 1943. His early life was marked by instability and crime. Raised primarily by his mother, who, as we've already seen, struggled with her own legal troubles and addiction, Manson started to become frequently in and out of juvenile detention centers. His formative years were characterized by a cycle of abandonment and criminal behavior. Manson stated in several interviews that when he was age 9, he set his school on fire. He also got repeatedly in trouble for skipping school and petty theft. Although there was a lack of foster home placements in 1947, at the age of 13, Manson was placed in the 𝗬𝗏𝗽 School for Boys in Terre Haute, Indiana, a school for male delinquent runaways, where he was housed by Catholic priests. It was a strict school where punishment for even the smallest infraction included beatings with a wooden paddle or leather strap. Manson ran away from 𝗬𝗏𝗽 and slept in the woods, under bridges, and wherever else he could find shelter. Manson fled home to his mother and spent Christmas in 1947 at his aunt and uncle's house in West Virginia. However, his mother did return him to the Catholic Reform School. 10 months later, he ran away to Indianapolis, and it was there where he committed his first documented charged crime of robbing a grocery store. At first, to simply find something to eat, however, Manson found a cigar box containing just over $100, which he used to rent a room on Indianapolis Skid Row and to buy food. For a time, Manson did get a job. He delivered messages for Western Union and was attempting to live a straight life. However, he began to quickly supplement his minimum wage job through theft. He was eventually caught, and in 1949, a judge sent him to Boys Town, a juvenile facility in Omaha, Nebraska. After 4 days there, he and a fellow student by the name of Blackie Nilsson obtained a gun and stole a car. They used it to commit 2 armed robberies on their way to the home of Nilsson's uncle in Peoria, Illinois. Nilsson's uncle was a professional thief, and when the boys arrived, he allegedly took them on as apprentices. Manson was arrested 2 weeks later during a nighttime raid on a Peoria store. In the investigation that followed, he was linked to his 2 earlier armed robberies, and he was sent to Indiana Boys School, a very strict reform school outside of Plainfield, Indiana. According to reports at Indiana Boys School, he was often beaten up and sexually assaulted by other boys at the school to the encouragement of a staff member. He ran away from the school 18 times. Manson developed a self-defense technique he later called the insane game, in which he would screech, grimace, and wave his arms to convince stronger aggressors that he was insane. After a number of failed attempts, he escaped with 2 other boys in February of 1951, and he first attempted to make it to California. The 3 escapees robbed filling stations while attempting to drive to the Golden State, and until they were finally arrested in Utah for the federal crime of driving a stolen car across state lines. Manson was sent to Washington, D.C.'s National Training School for Boys. On arrival, he was given aptitude tests, which determined that he was illiterate but had an above-average IQ of 109. He was also deemed aggressively antisocial. On the psychiatrist's recommendation, the one that deemed him antisocial, he was transferred to Natural Bridge Honor Camp, a minimum security institution in Virginia. His aunt visited him and told administrators that she would let him stay at her house and help him find work. He had a parole hearing scheduled for February of 1952. However, in January, he was caught sexually assaulting a boy at knife point, and he was then transferred to the Federal Reformatory in Petersburg, Virginia, where he committed a further 8 serious disciplinary actions, 3 of which involved SA, or sexual assault. He was then moved to a maximum security reformatory in Ohio, where he was expected to remain until his release at age 21. However, he was released in May of 1954, just prior to his 21st birthday, on good behavior, and went to live with his aunt and uncle again in West Virginia. For a few months, he did do some odd jobs around West Virginia, and met and married a hospital waitress named Rosie Jean Willis. Around October, about 3 months after he and his then pregnant wife left for Los Angeles, he was caught for driving the automobile which he had stolen in Ohio. So he took his new wife, who was pregnant, he stole a car and drove that car to California, where he was arrested for the crime. And again, charged with the federal crime, as taking a vehicle across state lines is a federal crime. After yet another psychiatric evaluation, he was given 5 years probation. His failure to appear at a Los Angeles hearing on an identical charge filed in Florida, so another stolen car, resulted in another arrest and him being transferred and incarcerated in Indianapolis. His probation was revoked, and he was sentenced then to an additional 3 years imprisonment at Terminal Island in Los Angeles. While Manson was serving his 2 sentences, Rosalie gave birth to their son, Charles Manson Jr., in 1956. During his first year at Terminal Island, Manson received visits from Rosalie and his mother, who had moved to Los Angeles. In March of 1957, when his visits from his wife ceased, his mother informed him that Rosalie had left him for another man and was living with that man. Less than 2 weeks before a parole hearing, Manson tried to escape by again stealing a car. He was given 5 years, another 5 years probation, and his parole was denied. And it is also noted that Charles Manson Jr. never met his father. His divorce from Rosalie was finalized in late 1958, and by the end of that year, Manson was pimping out a 16-year-old girl he had met and lured in by promises of a relationship and support, and was also living off another girl with wealthy parents. In September of 1959, he pleaded guilty to a charge of attempting to cash a forged U.S. Treasury check, which he claimed to have stolen from a mailbox. But that charge was dropped. He received a 10-year suspended sentence and probation after another young woman who had named Candy Stevens, who had an arrest record for prostitution, made a plea before the court that her and Manson were deeply in love and were married if Charlie was freed. Before the year's end, the woman did marry Manson, but also probably because she wouldn't have to testify against him. Manson took Candy and another woman to New Mexico for the purposes of basically pimping them out, resulting in him being held and questioned for violating the Mann Act. Though he was released, Manson correctly suspected that the investigation had not ended. When he disappeared in violation of his probation, a warrant was issued. An indictment for violation of the Mann Act followed in April of 1960. Following the arrest of one of the women for prostitution, Manson was arrested in June in Laredo, Texas, and was returned to Los Angeles, where he was ordered to serve his entire 10-year sentence from violating his parole. He spent a year trying to appeal the revocation of his probation, but in early of 1961, he was transferred from Los Angeles County Jail to the United States Penitentiary at McNeil Island, Washington. There, he started taking guitar lessons and actually became quite good. He obtained from another inmate the contact information of Phil Kaufman, a Universal Studios producer in Hollywood, and decided that he would attempt to go straight by becoming a musician upon his release. Interesting little fun note, Danny Trejo, the great actor Danny Trejo, was also incarcerated with Manson at the same time in the same jail, and even though Trejo more than cleaned up his act, Manson did not. Before Manson was eventually released in March of 1967, Candy obtained a divorce, but also cited that she had given birth to Charles's son, Charles Luther Manson, though that was never proven. The fact that she was a prostitute and the effect that he had been in prison for so long, that has never been proven that actually was Charles Manson's son. As far as we know, Manson never had any contact with either of his sons, quote unquote. He returned to California in 1967. He settled in Los Angeles for a few months before he went on to Berkeley, California, where he began accumulating the followers that would eventually become his family. Berkeley, in fact, San Francisco, the entire Bay Area was the hub of what is known as the 1960s counterculture or hippie culture. It was the summer of love. It was free love, free drugs, and Charlie fit in very well with that climate. He was a mixture of demented Christian religion, Buddhism, New Age, and drug culture. So he could talk the talk and walk the walk. In fact, he was able to get a special permission from his parole officer to move from Berkeley to the Haight-Ashbury district of San Francisco, and he would begin using amphetamines and LSD, as well as communing with the various young people that made up the hippie counterculture. During his time in the Haight-Ashbury, he read many works, including Stranger in a Strange Land. He read the Bible. He read the works of L. Ron Hubbard dealing with Scientology. He read the works of Dale Carnegie and listened exclusively to Beatles music, which also led him to read books and pamphlets on the Church of the Final Judgment, and who is a kind of a wacky form of Christianity that believes that Jesus and Satan would come together at the end of the world to judge humanity. So he got caught up in a lot of fringe religions as well as just hippie culture. Interesting point on Scientology, it is said that Charles Manson completed about 150 hours of auditing, which is the process by which thetans are examined in your body to see how many you have and your propensity to reaching the top levels of Scientology. He also had a right-hand man in his family by the name of Bruce Davis, who had worked at the Church of Scientology headquarters in London for a couple of years, so very heavily into Scientology as well as everything else. But he mainly began drawing together a family of mostly young women. When he first came to San Francisco, Manson became acquainted with Mary Bruner, who was a 23-year-old graduate of the University of Wisconsin at Madison. She was working as a library assistant at Berkeley, at the university in Berkeley. And Manson, until that point, was making a living by panhandling, playing his music on a street corner, that sort of thing. And he began living off of her. He then met another teenage runaway, Lynette Fromm, later nicknamed Squeaky. She would later attempt to assassinate President Ford, and convinced her to live with him and Bruner. They basically lived as a early version of a throuple, and it was said he even pimped the girls out for extra money. It is around this time that it was noted Manson seemed to favor individuals who were easy to manipulate, emotionally insecure, and social outcasts, and mostly women. He established himself as sort of a guru in the 𝗖𝗍𝗵 during the Summer of Love, and was emerging as kind of a leader in the hippie commune movement. The Manson family began to grow and flourish during this Summer of Love in 1967. Toward the end of the summer, he actually, in a bus that his followers had renovated, removed all the seats, put in pillows and blankets and stuff. They began traveling around in this old renovated school bus, and eventually settled in Topanga Canyon, Malibu, along the Venice Beach area in Los Angeles. In 1967, Bruner also became pregnant by Manson and supposedly gave birth to his son on April 15th, 1968, whom they named Valentine Michael. They were living in an abandoned house in Topanga Canyon, and she was assisted by several of the other young women who were already living with them to give birth. By the end of 1968, Manson had attracted the cornerstone of his family, including Bruner, Fromm, Charles Tex Watson, Bobby Beausoleil, and Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Leslie Van Houten. After several run-ins with the law in which he was able to ostensibly talk his way out of charges, he decided he wanted to make good on his plans to become a musician, and this is where his involvement with the Beach Boys began. On April 16, 1968, Dennis Wilson of the Beach Boys was driving through Malibu when he noticed two female hitchhikers that turned out to be Patricia Krenwinkel and Ella Jo Bailey, both members of Manson's family. He picked them up and dropped them off at their destination, and then again a few days later he noticed the same two girls hitchhiking again, and this time he took them to his home on Sunset Boulevard. Wilson later recalled that he told the girls about his involvement with the Maharishi, and told him that he too had been a guru, a guy named Charles. They also told him about their friend, a guy named Charles Manson, who'd recently come out of jail after 12 years and was very talented and knew a lot of the ways of the world. Wilson then went to a recording session. When he returned later that night, he was met in the driveway by Manson and the girls. And when Wilson walked into his home, about a dozen people, most of Manson's family, were already occupying his home. At first, Wilson was kind of captivated by the fact that there was free drugs and free love with these people. Of course, you have mostly all these young, pretty women. He partook, and that he had even decided that he and Charlie could probably be good friends. He called him the Wizard, and over the next few months, he housed them with the girls servicing him as needed for about 6 months. He then introduced Manson to his friend Terry Melcher, who is actually the son of actress Doris Day, who was the producer of The Byrds. Manson recorded numerous songs at Brian Wilson's home studio, and used band engineer Stephen Desper, the Beach Boys engineer, to record a lot of them, and he even recorded the B-side to one of the Beach Boys singles the following December in 1969. even though the song was actually eventually credited to Wilson, he said, because Manson had relinquished the credits. But still, we do know that Charles Manson wrote one of the songs on one of the Beach Boys singles, the B-side. And it was about this time that the honeymoon kind of ended. The family destroyed two of Wilson's cars. They began to do damage to his rented home. And he sought to eventually distance himself from Manson and moved out of his Sunset Boulevard house and basically abandoned it to them and moved to another residence, paying the landlord for the damages to the Sunset Drive house after they had evicted the Manson family. And when Manson attempted to reach out to him, he pretty much ignored them, leading to Manson threatening Wilson's housekeeper's life if he did not get Wilson to call him. It's also about this time that Wilson learned of the family's reputation for ending lives and racism, sexism, all sorts of other things, and he sought to distance himself as much as possible from them, as did 𝗟𝗃𝗪𝗪. Once they were thrown out of Wilson's former residence, they made their way to the Spahn Movie Ranch, which is a popular setting for westerns in the golden age of Hollywood, and it was now in a deteriorating condition. The 80-year-old owner, George Spahn, was mostly blind, disabled, and he allowed the family to live there as long as they did chores around the house and serviced him as well. And so that became their arrangement for quite a few months. It was after living at Spahn Ranch that Charles Manson and his family devolved into what could only be defined as a doomsday cult. He became fixated on the idea of an imminent apocalyptic race war between whites and blacks. He was a white supremacist and believed that if he could kill enough prominent white people and blame black people, that eventually a race war would stop, but the blacks would win it, and he and his family would then rise up to teach the black people how to actually build a civilization, because he did not think they were capable of it. And they would end up serving him as their master. That's Charles Manson's words, not mine. So after listening to the Beatles' White Album over and over, he took the term 𝗪𝗪𝗪 from one of their songs and began to refer to the upcoming war with that term. In March of 1969, he attempted to find 𝗪𝗪𝗪, knowing his former residence being at 1050 𝗖𝗿𝗄 Drive in the Hollywood Hills. He showed up on their property, only to find that Melcher and his then partner, actress Candace Bergen, that's right, Murphy Brown, were no longer living there. Instead, it had been rented to director-producer Roman Polanski and his wife, actress Sharon Tate. And it was here that Manson first encountered Tate by basically staring at her from her driveway. He also returned to the property a second time and tried to get into the guest house, but was pretty much chased off by their groundskeeper. Tate would then refer to Charles Manson as that creepy-looking guy anytime she referred to his visits to her home. From 1969 to 1971, the Manson family is implicated in several violent crimes. The first being the murder of local drug dealer Bernard 𝗪𝗪𝗪, who was affiliated somehow with the Black Panthers, though that was never proven. But basically, Manson family member Charles Tex Watson was dealing drugs. Crow was one of his main rivals, and during an argument, Crow threatened to kill everyone at Spahn Ranch, and Manson then tracked down Crow and shot him on July 1st, 1968, at a local Hollywood apartment and dumped the body in a dumpster. 34-year-old Gary Heinemann, who was a music teacher and a graduate student at UCLA, had previously befriended members of the family and allowed some of them to stay at his home in Topeka Canyon. According to Susan Atkins, Manson believed Hyman to be wealthy and had recently had an inheritance and sent Atkins, Bruner, and 𝗂𝗏𝗄𝗂 to Hyman's home to convince him to join the family and turn over all of his assets to Manson. They held Hyman hostage for 2 days in late July 1969, but he denied having any impending money. And during this time, Manson himself arrived with a sword and slashed his face and ear. And then after that, 𝗂𝗏𝗄𝗂 stabbed Hyman to death. And on the wall of his apartment, they drew a Black Panther symbol. Again, trying to stir up filth. And then the two most infamous encounters that Charles Manson followers did that resulted in some of the most heinous murders in the annals of American criminal history, and that is both the Tate and the LaBianca murders. On the night of August 8th, 1969, Watson took Atkins, Krenwinkel, and Linda Kasabian, who was a fairly new member of the family that would actually turn on them later when she realized what they were all about. They all went up to Terry Melcher's old residence at 10,050, now the residence of Roman Polanski and Sharon Tate, where Sharon Tate was there alone since Polanski was in Europe finishing the editing on a feature film. She was there with her former boyfriend, Jay Sebring, who was just a good friend of the family now, as well as Roman's friends, Wojciech 𝗏𝗏 and Abigail Folger, who were dating, and Abigail Folger was the heir apparent to the Folgers' coffee empire. They had been out to eat earlier that night at a local Mexican restaurant, which was a group favorite, and had returned home with 𝗏𝗏 falling asleep on the sofa in the living room, Abigail Folger retiring to their bedroom to read a novel, and both Sebring and Tate were in Sharon Tate and Roman Polanski's bedroom. Sharon Tate in the bed, about to go to sleep, reading, as she was 8.5 months pregnant, with Jay Sebring sitting on the foot of the bed having a discussion before he left for the evening. At just after midnight, the four family members entered the residence or entered the property. Watson climbed a telephone pole near the entrance gate and cut the phone line to the house. The group then backed their car down the bottom of the hill off the road to keep it out of sight, and then they decided to climb up a brushy embankment on the right of the gate and managed to get into the grounds. As they were approaching the house, they noticed headlights coming from a 1965 AMC Ambassador coupe, driven by 18-year-old Stephen Parent, who had only been there to see the Tate Polanski groundskeeper, in which he had bought a Wi-Fi unit from him. And Watson approached the car, lunged at Parent with a knife, giving him a defensive slash wound on the palm of his hand that severed several tendons and tore the watch off of his wrist. They then shot him 4 times in the chest and abdomen, killing him instantly. They then pushed the car up the driveway and out of sight, turning off its engine. Watson then cut the screen of a window in the main house and told Linda Kasabian to keep watch down by the gate to make sure no one else entered. So she stood by the now deceased Parent in his car and basically, I think, had her come to Jesus moment where she realized this was wrong. When they approached the house, after he had cut the screen, Watson removed it. He entered through a window and then managed to let Atkins and Krenwinkel in through the front door. As I'd said earlier, 𝗏𝗏 was asleep in the living room, and Abigail Folger was further back in the house, probably absorbed in a book. Watson then entered the living room. He woke 𝗏𝗏 and kicked him in the head a couple of times, stunning the young man. 𝗏𝗏 asked him who he was and what he was doing there. Watson replied, "I'm the devil, and I'm here on the devil's business." Then, on Watkins' direction, Atkins then found both Folger And Sebring and Tate, she brought Tate and Sebring together into the living room, tying them together with a nylon rope that they slung over the living room's ceiling beams. Sebring basically protested how rough they were treating Sharon, so Watson shot him. Basically, when Folger was brought out, she kind of freaked out, as you can imagine, that she was pushed very roughly back to her bedroom to get her purse, in which she gave the murderers all the money she had, which was about $70. Watson then stabbed Sebring 7 times. It was at this point that 𝗓𝗂𝗀𝗃, who had been tied up with a towel, managed to free himself and began fighting with Atkins, who stabbed at his legs with a knife. He fought his way out the front door and onto the porch, but it was here that Watson caught up with him, struck him over the head with the gun multiple times, stabbed him repeatedly, and shot him twice. However, he did not go down easily. He managed to run across the front lawn trying to get away, and at the end, when he finally died, he had been stabbed over 50 times. It's amazing what adrenaline and fight or flight can do. It was at this point that Abigail Folger began to struggle as well. She got away from Atkins and ran out to the pool area, where 𝗠𝗂𝗀𝗃 pursued her, caught up to her on the front lawn, and stabbed her 28 times, finally killing her. She did look at Kasabian and scream, "Help, help," and according to Kasabian, she just mouthed, "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry," to her. And basically a very bloody scene. It was then when Atkins basically told Sharon Tate she did not care about her or the life of her baby. They stabbed her and basically hoisted her up into the rafters before she died, and it was the final hanging that did kill Sharon Tate. Basically, Sebring was already dead when he was hoisted up the same way. Then the killers proceeded to write "pig," "death to pigs," "rise," all kinds of weird stuff, including Black Panther symbols all over the house. And then they left. And it was basically, the crime scene went undisturbed until it was discovered the next day by the housekeeper that was reporting for work. Interesting caveat here, Quincy Jones, R&B producer Quincy Jones, had been invited to the party since he was a good friend of Sebring, but had declined. So it's only just because he declined that Quincy Jones was saved from being another victim of the Manson family. The next night, because Manson was disappointed in what went on at the 𝗟𝗂𝗀𝗃 Tate house, he drove the previous 4, Atkins, 𝗠𝗂𝗀𝗃𝗃, Watson, and Kasabian, as well as Leslie Van Houten and Clem Grogan, to a house in the Los Feliz section of Los Angeles, 3301 Waverly Drive, the home of 44-year-old supermarket executive Lino LaBianca and his 43-year-old wife Rosemary, who was the co-owner of a dress shop. According to Atkins and Kasabian, Manson disappeared up the driveway and returned to say that he had tied up the house occupants and that Watson, 𝗠𝗂𝗀𝗃, and Van Houten should enter the property and deal with them. Basically, they stabbed the LaBiancas to death with kitchen knives from their own kitchen. And then, still wanting more blood, Manson and the other 3 drove 2 weeks later to the home of Donald Jerome Shorty Shea, who was a famous Hollywood stuntman and was anticipating killing him in the same fashion. However, Linda Kasabian knocked on the wrong door intentionally, according to her, and managed to rouse up several of his neighbors, causing them to flee the scene. And it was after an investigation that, and also a suspected drugs and automobile theft ring housing at the Spahn Ranch, that drew investigators to the Manson family. Upon raiding the Spahn Ranch, they arrested most members of the Manson family, eventually tying Watson, 𝗠𝗂𝗀𝗃𝗃, Kasabian, and Atkins to the Tate LaBianca murders. And a very famous trial that took over 2 years went on with every trick that Manson could pull, including holding up a newspaper headline from the Los Angeles Times where it said Manson guilty, Nixon declares, to try to taint the jury. He also made a leap for the judge when the judge said that he made a ruling that he disagreed with. He also attempted to put a hit on prosecutor Vincent 𝗟𝗏𝗍, who would later write the book 𝗪𝗿𝗪_𝗪𝗪. I could say a whole lot about 𝗟𝗏𝗍. He's not a 100% pure hero, but in this case, I think he did a good job. And basically, the prosecution put on a case that took several weeks, whereas the defense rested after 3 days. And Manson was then sent to the penalty phase, where he was sentenced to death, only to have that death commuted to life in prison when California did away with the death penalty. All of them were sentenced to death, but they have since all had their penalties commuted. As we know, Charles Manson passed away at the age of 83 in 2017 in Bakersfield, California, in the prison there. And we don't miss him. We don't miss any. There have been several, parole hearings for the others. Sharon Tate's mom, Doris Tate, led basically a crusade to keep all of them in prison and had managed to do that up until her death. So, yeah, I hope they all burn in hell, and that's pretty much where I'm going to stop here. I hope you enjoyed this. I'll be back soon with another true crime video, and until next time, keto and cry. Out.